In the summer of 1944, high above the Bavarian market town of Berchtesgaden, the Obersalzberg looked like an old postcard made dangerous. Dark pine, clean air, sloping pasture, and a line of mountains that seemed too indifferent to belong to any human century. From the valley road, a chalet could pass for a rich man's retreat. From the air, it was something else. A private government folded into a hillside, guarded by wire and patrols, and insulated by the old truth of mountains. That distance makes power feel pure. The Berghof was not Berlin. It had no marble ministries, no crowds to perform for, no long corridors where papers bred like flies. It was a place for quiet sentences spoken as if they were natural laws, and for decisions that would be paid for in cities the speaker would never see. The men who worked there learned to read small signals, the sudden closing of roads, the tightening of checkpoints, the way a local landscape could be turned, without ceremony, into a perimeter. And yet, for all the security, there was a strange vulnerability built into the very idea of a retreat. A ruler who hides is still a body, still bound to routine, still dependent on weather, appetite, and the small consolations that make isolation bearable. By that point in the war, the map was beginning to betray Germany. The West was no longer a wall, but a breach, and the East was no longer a frontier, but a flood. Armies moved with a kind of grim arithmetic. Divisions consumed and replaced, rail lines strained, fuel hoarded, airspace contested. The Reich had become a machine running hot with losses, held together by fear, habit, and a single man's voice. In that kind of system, the leader is not only a commander, he is a symbol, a superstition, an explanation that spares millions from admitting the obvious. Remove him, and you might unmake the spell. Remove him, and you might also unmake the errors that have been saving your enemies. London, meanwhile, was learning the late war language of choice. It was no longer enough to fight well. One had to decide what kind of victory was acceptable, what methods did not poison the peace before it arrived, and what shortcuts were only mirages. Beneath the visible war of ships and squadrons ran a quieter war of files, safe houses, intercepted letters, and men trained to turn ordinary objects into sudden endings. The Special Operations Executive had been built for that hidden work. It trafficked in sabotage and rumor, in rail lines cut in the night, and radio sets carried under coats. It lived in the moral fog that forms whenever a state asks someone to do what it cannot say aloud. Assassination sat at the far edge of that fog. In principle, it was simple, almost childish in its clarity. A monster is a single throat, and a single bullet ends it. In practice, it was a question with teeth. Would killing the dictator shorten the war or harden it? Would it break Germany's cohesion or give it a cleaner martyr's legend? Would a successor bargain or fight more intelligently? A government can tolerate many uncertainties, but it cannot tolerate being uncertain about what kind of act it is committing, because that uncertainty spreads downward into every operative and every order. On a desk, among the usual clutter of memoranda and maps, a dossier could begin as a plain object and end as a moral instrument. A few typed pages, a code name, a list of methods, a narrowing of possibilities. The field of action reduced to two kinds of places: the mountain retreat where a man's habits might expose him, and the rails where an empire's leader still depended on schedules and water tanks. Somewhere inside that paper logic lay a more intimate image: a footpath near a tree line, a brief stretch of open ground, and a solitary figure who could not bear to feel himself watched. At the edge of a war fought by millions, a single walk had become a strategic problem. The next question was not how to kill. It was who would dare to do it, and what the world would look like if the shot succeeded. Baker Street, in the summer of 1944, did not look like a place where the fate of dictators was decided. London had become a city of paperwork and ration lines, of blackout cloth and bomb damage repaired just enough to keep moving. The headquarters of the Special Operations Executive sat inside this ordinary strain, and that was the point. The organization had been created to be unromantic, to be a practical instrument for subversion, sabotage, and the cultivation of small fires behind enemy lines. Its work had never been clean. It lived among partisans, defectors, criminals, and patriots in the same breath, and tried to turn their motives into results. By June, the calendar itself felt heavy. The Allied landings in Normandy had cracked the Western Wall, but they had not yet proven what would follow. A beachhead is a beginning, not an ending. On the other side of Europe, the Red Army was advancing with a blunt momentum that could not be negotiated with, and German planners were beginning to imagine a future in which the Reich might be fought over rather than governed. In that atmosphere, even a question as old as tyranny felt newly urgent. If the head is removed, does the body die, or does it convulse into something worse? The spark, in the files that later surfaced, was almost absurdly small, a hint that Hitler might be vulnerable during a visit far from the main war rooms, a whisper passing through the channels that reached an outpost office. It was not acted upon directly, but it served a bureaucratic purpose, which is often how history moves. It created a reason for a meeting. It forced a senior man to gather his staff and ask, in a room where the air smelled of tobacco and damp wool, whether assassination had become a reasonable instrument. There was, by then, a recent lesson in what it meant to kill a high Nazi figure. In 1942, Reinhard Heydrich had been attacked and later died, and the German response had been a spectacle of reprisals meant to teach the world that targeted killing would be paid for in civilians. It was a lesson written in villages and hostages. The practical mind, staring at that ledger, could argue that a similar logic might apply if Hitler were struck. A regime that lived by terror did not need much imagination to create fresh terror in response. But Hitler was not Heydrich. Heydrich was a powerful instrument inside a machine. Hitler was the machine's voice, and a kind of religious object to many of those who followed him. That difference changes the mathematics. The question was not merely whether killing Hitler would be worth the moral cost. It was whether it would even work as strategy. The first thing the staff did was what bureaucracies always do when confronted with a dangerous abstraction. They translated it into categories. A paper was drafted. The object was stated plainly, in the language of an office that had trained itself to make the unthinkable sound routine. The means were listed, not as fantasies, but as tools. A rifle, a shaped charge weapon, grenades, explosives for rails, poison, and other clandestine methods that did not require a soldier's uniform, to be honest. The scene of operations was narrowed to two places where the dictator might be caught by geometry rather than by luck: the Berchtesgaden area and the Führer's train. There is a particular coldness to that kind of document. It does not hate. It does not plead. It simply assumes that a man's life can be treated as a problem of access, timing, and probability. Yet, behind the coldness is an anxiety that the document itself cannot admit, the fear of doing something irreversible and discovering too late that it had been a gift to the enemy. From the beginning, the plan lived on intelligence that was always slightly behind the moving target. Hitler did not advertise his calendar. He moved through the Reich with a paranoia that grew more refined as the war turned against him. His train did not appear on schedules like a minister's tour, Stations learned of its approach with little warning. Roads were cleared suddenly. Local police became temporary instruments of the guard. The dictatorship was, in this sense, a traveling fortress. And yet the fortress had seams, because no human being can live without routine. Even the most paranoid man must sleep and eat. He must breathe, drink, defecate, walk, and accept a barber's hands near his throat. What the SOE needed was not the courage to imagine assassination. It needed the smaller, rarer thing, a reliable habit. A room in England, not far from the coast and not glamorous in any way, became one of the places where that habit was claimed to have been found. The interrogation of prisoners had its own rhythm in 1944. Men came in from Normandy with the smell of cordite still on them, shocked by captivity, some eager to bargain, some silent out of discipline, and some simply tired. Among them was a German who had served close enough to Hitler's life at the Berghof to notice what most people never see about power, that it repeats itself. He spoke of a morning walk. The detail mattered because it was so ordinary. Hitler, when he stayed at the mountain residence, would rise late, be attended to, and then, often, step out for a short walk to a small tea-house on a nearby hill. The walk was not a parade. It was a private ritual, almost a performance for himself. He disliked being watched too closely. Guards existed, but the whole arrangement depended on discretion, on distance, on the belief that the mountain itself was part of the security system. The prisoner's account suggested that, for a small stretch of path, the dictator might be out of the direct sight of sentry posts. In that space, a rifle could do what armies could not. To the men making plans, this was the sweetest kind of intelligence. It came with a picture attached. It conjured a footpath, trees, and a moving target with a predictable time window. It offered the possibility of a shot that did not require a convoy, a banquet, a bomb under a table, or the cooperation of a disloyal adjutant. It offered the straight line of a marksman's skill, but even that intelligence carried its own warning. It was a single testimony about a habit that could change overnight. Dictators adjust their routines for reasons they never share. A rumor reaches them. A dog barks at the wrong time. A subordinate flinches. A plan begins to grow in the mind of an enemy, and the target changes course without knowing why. The SOE did not need a plausible story. It needed repetition. The Obersalzberg itself, in the files, became a landscape to be measured like a battlefield. The planners studied photographs and maps. They made note of roads, fences, patrol patterns, and the presence of wire mesh that could be cut. They identified likely approaches and the places where a man could lie still in shadow and see the path. They paid attention to a trivial-sounding signal that, in such work, is worth more than a confession. When Hitler was in residence, a Nazi flag could be seen from the nearby town. The mountain might hide him, but the regime could not resist advertising its presence. The plan that grew around this intelligence had the shape of an SOE operation, which is to say it was both bold and fragile. Two men would be inserted, not into Germany directly, but into Austria, with the assumption that borders and uniforms could still be used as camouflage in a collapsing world. One man would be a Pole who spoke German well enough to pass. The other would be a British officer trained for the precise work of a sniper, the sort of man who could remain patient without romanticizing his own patience. They would be dropped by parachute and picked up by the small machinery of human help, a safe shelter, a local guide, a vehicle, perhaps a shopkeeper who hated the regime enough to risk his life for a chance to end it. In the documents that later surfaced, an inside man was identified in Salzburg, connected by family to a prisoner of war. His hostility to the Nazis made him useful, and that is one of the grim truths of secret work. Virtue becomes logistics. He would shelter the men and transport them toward Berchtesgaden disguised as German mountain troops, whose uniforms and rifles would not attract suspicion in that terrain. The disguise mattered not because it would fool the SS up close, but because it would buy time, and time is what a sniper lives on. The British sniper, in training grounds far from Bavaria, practiced with a German rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. It was one of those ironies that war produces without effort. The instrument meant to serve the Reich could be turned against its leader. The work was not dramatic. It was hours of repetition, firing at moving targets, learning the feel of the weapon and the delay between decision and impact. A sniper does not rise to the moment. He builds the moment out of boredom. A secondary weapon was prepared, a pistol fitted with a suppressor, so that the man approaching the firing position could deal with an unexpected encounter without turning the mountains into an alarm bell. The plan also included contingencies that belonged to the mind of an engineer. If a rifle failed, there were other means. A shaped charge weapon could be used against a vehicle. Grenades could be carried. The act was to be simple, but the failure modes were many, and the planners, to their credit, did not pretend otherwise. The more the plan hardened into detail, the more it revealed what it depended on. It depended on weather and visibility. It depended on the target's presence at the Berghof and on his willingness to take the walk. It depended on the ability of two foreign men to move through a guarded region without being trapped by a random inspection. It depended on the behavior of German patrols, on whether they marched by habit or by suspicion. It depended on the willingness of a local helper to remain calm while sheltering men who would bring the full weight of the SS down on anyone connected to them. And it depended, above all, on what would happen the moment after the shot. In a different place, at a different hour, the plan expanded into other possibilities, each one a confession that the sniper plan might be fantasy. Hitler's train, the Führerzug, was both protected and vulnerable. It was protected by secrecy and by the ability to seal off stations, but it was vulnerable because even a fortress on rails must drink. A train needs water. It takes water on at predictable points, and that work is done by workers who are not all fanatics. So the SOE studied the idea of poisoning the train's water supply. The thinking was almost clinical. Choose a poison that is tasteless, potent, and hard to detect. Introduce it by a method that would not require a heroic insider. Use routine maintenance and cleaning as the point of entry. On paper, it sounds like the perfect assassin's method, because it does not require a marksman, only access. But access is the hardest currency in the Reich. A station is a social system. Workers talk, guards watch. Procedures shift when fear rises. Poison is not a weapon. It is a relationship. Other schemes appeared in the same orbit of thought. Explosives could be used to derail the train in a tunnel. A suitcase bomb might be thrown from a platform at the right moment. An attack could be staged on a road between the Berghof and another headquarters where a car must move through predictable turns. Air bombardment of the Obersalzberg was even considered, coupled with an airborne force to kill the dictator amid the smoke. Each proposal had the same shape: convert a man into a target, then convert a target into a method. What made Operation Foxley unusual was not that the British had imagined killing Hitler. Many people had imagined it, including Germans who were closer to him than any British agent could ever be. The unusual thing was the way the British imagination collided with a strategic doubt that did not go away. It was one thing to say Hitler deserved to die. That was obvious. It was another thing to say that killing him would help win the war sooner. By 1944, Hitler had become, in the eyes of many professional soldiers, a catastrophically poor commander. He held ground too long, ordered counterattacks into ruin, and treated maps as if they were moral documents rather than representations of reality. He distrusted retreat, even when retreat was the only sane way to preserve a force. He elevated loyalty over competence. He interfered with operational decisions that generals should have made. In this sense, he was not only an enemy, he was, unintentionally, a collaborator in his own defeat. Some in the SOE and in the British establishment argued the opposite. They believed that Hitler's personal hold on German morale, his almost superstitious aura among ordinary people, was one of the last supports of the regime. Remove him, and the nation might fracture. Remove him, and the generals might finally act without the personal oath that bound them. Remove him, and the party might lose the one figure who could command both the army and the SS without open civil war. This argument had its own ruthless clarity. It treated Hitler as a keystone in a political arch. The arch was already cracking under bombings, shortages, and defeats. Take out the keystone and the whole structure might fall, not because Germans became virtuous, but because no replacement could hold the contradictory parts together. But the counter-argument was equally clear, and it had a cruel elegance that is common in war councils. If Hitler was incompetent, then his continued life was an advantage. Kill him, and the Reich might acquire a more competent leadership. That leadership might withdraw to defensible lines, fight more intelligently, and inflict greater losses before surrendering. It might also attempt a partial peace, offering concessions in the West to preserve power in the East, or offering to hand over one enemy to fight another. In a coalition war, such moves are poison. They tempt allies into mistrust. There was also the moral argument, and it was not sentimental. Some feared that assassination would transform Hitler into a martyr figure in the German imagination, a man murdered by foreign enemies rather than defeated on the battlefield. It could give the regime a myth that outlived the regime itself, a legend in which Hitler's death became proof that Germany had been stabbed rather than beaten. Others answered that this was inevitable anyway, that a dictator of that scale becomes a legend regardless of how he dies, and that the practical short-term mattered more than the long-term fables. These were not arguments between saints and cynics. They were arguments between people trained to think in consequences. That training does not purify anyone. It simply changes the weight of words. Murder becomes elimination. Revenge becomes reprisals. Hope becomes probability. The SOE did what organizations do when faced with a debate they cannot resolve by logic. It continued to plan. Planning becomes a way of delaying decision while appearing busy. The dossier grew. Maps were marked. Photographs were collected. The habits of a man in a mountain house were turned into paragraphs with times attached. The target was described as a late riser, seen first by his barber, then either taking his walk or attending a conference. It was noted that he drank tea with milk, and that the order of pouring might conceal a slight change in appearance if poison were introduced into the milk rather than the tea. Details like this have a strange intimacy. A dictator's genocide can be known as a statistic. His preference for milk becomes a practical opening. The act of collecting such detail also revealed the system's dependence on rumor. Much of the intelligence came from prisoners and from those who claimed proximity. A valet, a guard, a deserter, a disaffected local. Each source offered something, and each source could be wrong. The more the planners wrote, the more their own writing became a kind of wager. If the world they described existed, then the operation might be possible. Meanwhile, the real world was changing faster than their paper. On July 20th, 1944, in a military headquarters far from the Bavarian hills, German officers attempted to do what the SOE was only drafting. They tried to kill Hitler. The bomb exploded. The dictator survived. In a single day, the internal politics of the Reich tightened like a noose. Suspicion became policy. Security measures hardened. Arrests spread. The regime turned its fear into theater, hanging conspirators and filming their deaths, transforming justice into intimidation. For the British planners, the July attempt was a lesson as sharp as any memo. It showed that even those closest to Hitler could fail. It also showed what the regime did when threatened. If Hitler lived, he would emerge more convinced of his own providence, more paranoid, more determined to trust only the most loyal. If Hitler died, the aftermath would not be a clean transition. It would be a struggle among men who commanded armed organizations, and the struggle would happen in a country already collapsing. The July attempt also struck at the practical heart of Foxley. If the plan depended on Hitler's habits, then the moment a bomb had nearly killed him, habits would change. A dictator who believes himself hunted does not continue to stroll where trees can hide a rifle. Even if he did, the guards would no longer keep their distance out of deference to his discomfort. They would crowd him, watch him, and widen the perimeter. The very detail that made the walk plausible, his dislike of being watched, would be overridden by the fear of being killed. And there was another problem, quieter but decisive: Hitler's presence at the Berghof itself. The Berghof had been a stage for his social life and a symbol of his self-image as a man of destiny in nature. Yet by mid-July 1944, the war had become too urgent and too personal for him to indulge that stage. He left the Berghof and did not return. The mountain retreat remained, but it became a museum of a vanished confidence. In that sense, the Obersalzberg in late 1944 was an illusion. It looked like an address. It looked like a location where a sniper could wait. But it was no longer the dictator's life. His life had contracted into bunkers, headquarters, and rooms where maps were pushed around as if they were promises. A plan that required him to take air and walk among trees was already slipping into the kind of fantasy that intelligence services, if they are honest, learn to recognize. Still, the planning did not stop immediately, because bureaucracies do not stop on a dime. The momentum of a file can outlive the conditions that gave birth to it. There were also reasons, by late 1944, to keep thinking about assassination even if the Berghof was no longer the stage. Hitler traveled between headquarters. He still had a train. He still had a mouth that drank tea. There remained, in theory, other loci of action: stations, sidings, roads, and the places where the Reich's leader must move, because even a paranoid man cannot command an empire from a single chair. In the winter of 1944 and into early 1945, Germany's situation became openly desperate. Allied aircraft ranged across the Reich, turning industrial cities into rubble fields. The Ardennes offensive rose and collapsed in blood and fuel shortages. Soviet armies pushed from the east, ripping through defenses that no longer had reserves behind them. The regime responded with new rhetoric and old violence, executing deserters, mobilizing boys and old men, and promising miracle weapons that could not change arithmetic. In that atmosphere, it is tempting to think that killing Hitler would have been a clean mercy. Yet the very desperation of the moment created a different fear. A cornered regime is unpredictable. If Hitler died, who would control the weapons, the prisons, the orders? Would the SS accept command from an army officer? Would the army accept a party successor? Would the Reich fracture into civil conflict, and if it did, would that shorten the war or turn it into a chaotic slaughter that delayed surrender? Some in the SOE argued that the German officer corps, many of whom now recognized defeat privately, were still bound by a personal oath to Hitler. As long as he lived, they retained a kind of outward loyalty that preserved the machine's functioning, however imperfectly. Remove him, and the oath evaporates. The generals could move openly against the party. The party's grip might loosen. The Wehrmacht and the SS might compete, and competition in a collapsing state is often the beginning of collapse itself. But others looked at the same fact and saw danger. Remove Hitler, and the generals might take command of a more rational defense. They could retreat to shorter lines, trade space for time, and make the Allied advance costlier. They could also attempt what some Germans had long dreamed of, a negotiated settlement with Britain and America that preserved Germany from Soviet occupation, offering surrender in the West while continuing the fight in the East. Even if such a settlement was unlikely, the attempt itself could fracture the Allied coalition, and coalition unity was one of the greatest weapons the Allies possessed. This was the core of the clinical dilemma. A dictator is a moral horror, but he can also be a strategic asset to his enemies if he is incompetent enough. Killing him might satisfy justice, but undermine the conditions that make victory inevitable. By spring 1945, the war's end was visible, but it was not yet here. That is another moment when secret services become restless. As the machine grinds toward an outcome, there is a desire to shorten the grind, to cut out the last months of killing. It is in that mood that a cable was sent across the Atlantic asking about a British Army captain serving as a military attaché in Washington, whether he might be available for a dangerous job. The request, in its plainness, shows that even late, even when the Reich was collapsing, the idea of assassination had not entirely died inside the file. Then came another cable, days later, withdrawing the request. Under present circumstances, the men in charge did not feel justified in calling for that officer. The phrase is careful. It does not say the plan was immoral. It does not say it was impossible. It says only that the circumstances did not justify the act. That is the language of a state trying to keep its hands clean while still imagining dirty work. The circumstances were changing by the hour. Hitler was increasingly confined to Berlin. His train mattered less than his bunker. The Obersalzberg was no longer relevant, and the Allies were advancing so quickly that the value of any single strike diminished. When the enemy is falling anyway, the moral cost of assassination begins to outweigh the marginal gain. Killing Hitler in late April 1945 would not save the same number of lives as killing him in July 1944. Timing in these calculations is not a detail. It is the heart. If Foxley had been executed in the summer of 1944, and if the shot had been successful, what then? It is here that the plan becomes not merely an assassination scheme, but a study in how regimes endure and collapse. The first consequence would have been a scramble for legitimacy. The Nazi state was not a normal government with lawful succession. It was a hierarchy of competing power centers held together by Hitler's personal authority. The party had its own institutions. The SS had its own armed empire. The Wehrmacht had its own traditions and resentments. Ministers, Gauleiters, and security chiefs lived in a constant struggle for proximity to Hitler's favor. Remove him, and the struggle would have become open. It is possible that the immediate response would have been a wave of violence, because violence is the easiest tool for a frightened dictatorship. The SS would have searched for conspirators, not only inside Germany, but across borders, and in doing so, it would have turned paranoia into policy even more aggressively than it did after July 20th. If the assassination were clearly foreign, The regime could have framed Hitler's death as an act of enemy treachery and used it to demand renewed sacrifice. In a country already exhausted, such demands can still work for a time, because fear is often stronger than disbelief. It is also possible that the assassination would have shattered something more subtle, the faith that had allowed many Germans to keep fighting despite the evidence. Here, the SOE memo writers were thinking like students of political psychology. They believed that a large part of the population regarded Hitler as a man of destiny, and that this sense of destiny was one of the last supports keeping the structure upright. A man can endure hunger and bombing if he believes there is a genius guiding the chaos. Take away the genius, and the suffering becomes simply suffering, without purpose. The spell breaks. This is plausible, but spells do not break evenly. Some people would have turned to despair, others would have turned to rage. The regime might have fractured, but fracture can mean two outcomes: collapse into surrender or collapse into factional violence. A civil war inside a collapsing Germany in 1944 would have been a catastrophe measured in civilians because the weapons were already everywhere and the men with authority were trained in brutality. The third possibility is the one that haunted the opponents of Foxley: competence. Hitler's mistakes were not small. They were often the difference between a German defeat in months and a German defeat in years. If Hitler died and a more rational command took over, the war might have lasted longer. A withdrawal to more defensible positions could have increased Allied casualties substantially. There is a bleak logic here that is easy to miss. The quicker the enemy collapses, the fewer people die, even if the collapse is achieved by leaving a monster alive long enough to keep making mistakes. Yet competence does not guarantee unity. The Germans best positioned to lead a post-Hitler war were not necessarily the Germans best positioned to end it. A military junta might have been willing to negotiate, but negotiating would have required concessions that the Nazis had made impossible without admitting guilt. It would also have required the Allies to accept a peace that might have left much of the Nazi apparatus intact, because dismantling the regime and punishing its leaders were not side issues. They were becoming part of the moral purpose of the war. Here is another irony. Killing Hitler might have made it easier for many Nazis to survive. The dictator's death could have been used to argue that the evil was personal, that the system had been misled by one man, and that a new leadership could restore order without dismantling the party's foundations. That narrative is seductive in defeated societies because it offers dignity without repentance. A living Hitler in 1945 was a guarantee that the system's crimes could not be blamed on anyone else. His presence in the bunker forced the Reich to die as itself, not as a rebranded successor state. And then there is the problem of the Allies themselves. In 1944, Allied unity was not a sentimental matter. It was a strategic necessity. Britain and America could not win the war quickly without the Soviet Union's pressure from the East. The Soviet Union could not win the war quickly without Western pressure from the West. Each side feared the other's post-war intentions, even while relying on the other's armies. In such a coalition, any German attempt at a separate peace would have been explosive. Even if Britain and America refused such a deal, the mere rumor of negotiations could have poisoned trust, and trust in coalition war is as valuable as tanks. A successful assassination might have opened that door. A new German leadership might have tried to surrender to the West while continuing to fight the Soviets, or at least while slowing the Soviet advance. From the Western perspective, such a move could have looked like a chance to end the war sooner. From the Soviet perspective, it would have looked like betrayal. The result could have been a diplomatic crisis at the very moment military cooperation was essential. If the objective was to defeat Germany decisively and prevent it from returning to war, anything that fractured the coalition could have been a disaster. This is why the question, would killing Hitler end the war, is too simple. The better question is, what kind of war would follow his death? Wars do not end because a man dies. They end when institutions collapse, when armies lose cohesion, when logistics fail, when populations stop believing, and when leaders decide that surrender is less dangerous than continuing. Hitler's death could have accelerated some of those forces. It could also have delayed them by replacing chaos with competence. When later commentators say Foxley was abandoned because Hitler was useful alive, they are capturing one thread of the debate, but not the whole tapestry. There were practical constraints that may have been decisive on their own. Intelligence was incomplete. Timing slipped. The dictator stopped visiting the very location that made the sniper plan plausible. In the end, the regime collapsed under the weight of armies and bombs, and Hitler died by his own hand. Operation Foxley became one more example of how secret work often lives as paper rather than action. And yet the existence of the file matters because it shows the kind of thinking that war forces on states that want to remain civilized while fighting an enemy that has abandoned civilization. The SOE did not debate whether Hitler deserved to die. That was not the question. The question was whether killing him would save lives or cost lives, shorten the war or prolong it, simplify victory or complicate it. It is a calculus that feels obscene, and yet it is the calculus that governments make when they are responsible for millions of soldiers and civilians. Back at the Obersalzberg, the mountains did what mountains always do. They endured. The Berghof itself, once a symbol of distance and invulnerability, became an empty stage. Its power had never been the stones and timber. Its power was the presence of a man who believed the world could be bent by will. When that presence vanished, the retreat became just another object waiting to be destroyed. There is a final irony in Foxley that is almost too neat to be real, but history often indulges such ironies. The British planners spent months converting a dictator into a target, narrowing the possibilities, measuring paths and fences, training a sniper, searching for the right combination of courage and language skill. Meanwhile, Germans inside the system tried to do the same thing with a bomb in a briefing room and failed. The dictator emerged more paranoid and more violent. The British plan, which had been designed to avoid the need for a German insider, was undone by the very fact of German insider action because it changed the target's life. In the end, Hitler was killed not by a foreign assassin, but by the logic of defeat and the fear of capture. His suicide did not redeem anything. It simply spared him a public accounting, and it spared Germany the sight of its leader brought to trial like an ordinary criminal. It also deprived the world of a clean narrative in which justice is done by human hands rather than by collapse. Operation Foxley offers a darker kind of clarity. It shows that even when the target is the most hated man alive, the act of killing him is not simply moral. It is political, it is psychological, it is strategic. It is also, in the hands of a state, bureaucratic, reduced to typed lines and coded names and practical questions about tea, milk, fences, and patrols. The moral cost is obvious. Assassination is a form of killing that refuses the reciprocal risk of battle. It is death delivered by concealment. It can be justified in war, and often is, but it always stains the hand that uses it, even when the target is monstrous. The strategic risk is less obvious, and therefore more dangerous. Killing a dictator can create a martyr, can harden a population's sense of injury, can enable successors who are more competent, can fracture coalitions, and can shape the post-war narrative in ways that outlast the war itself. For the men who wrote the Foxley papers, the most unsettling possibility was that killing Hitler might have made the war harder to win. Not because Germany would suddenly become strong again, but because Germany might become less self-destructive. A monster who miscalculates can be defeated faster than a committee that calculates well. That is a grotesque truth, but it is a truth that late war planners could not ignore. So the file remained a file. The rifle was never carried into the Bavarian woods for that purpose. The local helper remained a name on paper. The path to the tea house remained for Hitler, a walk he would never again take after the war tightened around him. And the British state, which had created an organization to set Europe ablaze, discovered that some fires, even against a tyrant, were too uncertain to light. History did change, but not by that shot. It changed by the slow attrition of armies, by the grinding collapse of supply, by the bombing that turned cities into ash, by the Soviet advance that swallowed provinces, and by the internal rot of a regime that had built itself on fear and fantasy. Operation Foxley sits beside those forces like a scalpel laid next to a sledgehammer, precise, tempting, and perhaps unnecessary. The mountains above Berchtesgaden kept their silence. They had witnessed a man trying to turn scenery into destiny. They then witnessed his disappearance into bunkers and rubble. In their indifference, there is a final lesson that the Foxley file hints at without stating. Power likes to imagine itself protected by distance and ceremony, but it remains dependent on the body and its habits. A dictator can command armies, but he still must drink tea, still must take a walk, still must trust someone to cut his hair. That dependence is vulnerability. The question is not whether it can be exploited. The question is whether exploiting it serves the larger end or merely satisfies a desire for neatness in a world that rarely offers it.